Good morning, everyone. I'm Corby Kummer from the Atlantic and, in fact, the Aspen Institute. I'm very glad to be talking about one of the most neutral topics to be presented at Kent Presents, which is genetically modified organisms, genetically engineered food and seeds, about which I've discovered no one has an opinion. So it was awfully good of the Rosens to schedule this session and to invite Stewart Brand, legendary to my generation and every generation's environmentalist whose Whole Earth catalog was a fundamental part of my education, as it was my idea of what publishing could and should mean. And now we have a recent book, 2010, by Stewart, which is called Whole Earth Discipline, and I hope you will buy it as I did and hungrily underline it as I did, because I discovered, really to my great disappointment, that although I wrote the first book in English on the slow food movement, I was a champion of organic farming and all that it connotes, which we'll be talking about a bit later. Throughout my whole career in writing about food for several decades now, I've also come around to supporting GMOs in a way that would have been surprising to me even 5 or 6 years ago. And I was rather sure in my very ignorant way that Stewart would be a longtime opponent of GMOs. I think we might all be surprised and enlightened by the talk that he's about to give with a couple of slides that will I'll be down there enjoying them with you. And so with great pleasure, I give you Stewart Brand, and then we'll come back and have a conversation.
Slides, please.
He's already flogged the book, so I'm kind of embarrassed I'm going to quote from it for a minute because it goes with this slide. Began a chapter called Green Genes. I dare say the environmental movement has done more harm with its opposition to genetic engineering than with any other thing we've been wrong about. We've starved people, hindered science, hurt the natural environment, and denied our own practitioners a crucial tool. In defense of a bizarre idea of what is, quote, natural, we reject the very thing that Rachel Carson encouraged us to pursue, which she called the new science of biotic controls. Also, we make ourselves look as conspicuously irrational as those who espouse intelligent design, or I might add anti-vaccination, or ban stem cell research, and we teach that irrationality to the public and to decision makers. So in July a couple of years ago, when Greenpeace all suited up in a hazmat outfit for no other reason, that's mist coming down, than to look good for the photographs, they destroyed GMO wheat research that was going on in Canberra, Australia. The local newspaper, magazine, that, come on, back. Not too back. This is a little tricky. Said that Greenpeace had lost its way, and that it is now a sad, dogmatic, reactionary phalanx of anti-science zealots. In this respect, I saw how that happened. So I was around in San Francisco in the mid-'70s, right after the Asilomar Conference on recombinant DNA, and Friends of the Earth had just been set up by David Brower, who'd been expelled from Sierra Club on nuclear issues. And they had two scientists who were their science advisors, Paul Ehrlich, my old teacher from Stanford, and Lewis Thomas, the Lives of a Cell guy. And they were about to go onto a big Friends of the Earth campaign against recombinant DNA. And both Paul and Lewis said, don't do that because there's some beneficial uses for the environment, such as the Ames test, which tests for carcinogenicity and so on. And Friends of the Earth said, we're going to do it anyway. And Lewis Thomas and Paul Ehrlich said, if you do that, we resign. And Friends of the Earth said, goodbye. And since then, a lot of the environmental movement turned away from science in regard to biotechnology, and a lot of it is still there. Meanwhile, people who are looking at the ethics of this, like the Newfield Council on Bioethics, said as they looked at it, as they saw how GM crops were moving around the world, a great benefit to farmers, there's a moral imperative for making genetically modified crops readily and economically available. Gradually and quietly, one or two organizations, the best of them being the Nature Conservancy, which is the most science-driven of all of the conservation organizations, said, oh, by the way, GMOs can be beneficial to things that we care about. And this is part of a whole array of things that I would call green biotech. Green chemistry, a lot of it can be done now with living organisms with much less impact on the reagents and all that thing. Biofuels are rightly contentious. There's a lot of misuse of biofuels. It might be that if you go to the cellular level with cyanobacteria, they work better. I'll talk about greener agriculture. Vat-grown meat, or its equivalent of replacing all of the cows and sheep and whatnot out in the landscape, ripping up the landscape worse than anything else that humans do. That would be swell. Biosensors. And just 2 sessions ago, I talked about de-extinction from Revive and Restore, based in San Francisco. Ryan Phelan over there, who runs it. We're talking about basically helping endangered species with genome enrichment. And there's also new uses of potentially going after really problematic invasive species with really, really powerful biocontrols. It could well be that Lyme disease disappears from New England within a decade because you go after the deer ticks. I suspect that nobody will miss them if they're gone. One of the byproducts, an important product in terms of conservation, of all of these new efficiencies coming to agriculture, basically the green revolution that Norman Borlaug got the Peace Prize for, going on and on, more and more intensification of agriculture means less landscape use for agriculture. And Jesse Ossibel at Rockefeller University thinks we're now at peak farmland, which is fantastic, because by far the most destructive thing that humans do to natural systems is agriculture. If we intensify it more and more, that leaves more and more land being spared. Land sparing is the term for it, to go back to nature, and that's happening. By the way, he had 2 lines there. The lower one is if we stop deluding ourselves about biofuels, corn for ethanol and so on, just forget most of that idea, then we get even more land spared for nature. So in ag, we've already got the point that it wasn't intentional by Monsanto and Syngenta and the other players that they have really benefits for conservation. But in fact, BT cotton and BT corn and so on means there's less pesticide out there. Pesticide is horrible. It takes down the bugs across the way. Everything eats the bugs. The whole biodiversity and bioabundance goes down when there's too much pesticide around. And when it's right in the plant itself, there's less of it on the landscape. No-till, no plowing is one of the most efficient energy, water, everything else efficient things you can do in agriculture. And with Roundup Ready, as they say, herbicide-tolerant soybeans, which is now over 90% of all the soybean crops, they don't have to plow them anymore. That's a huge gain. Likewise, there's now crops that are being designed to be drought-tolerant. There are more droughts in certain regions with climate change. And a friend of ours, Pam Ronald, at UC Davis, has developed a flood-tolerant rice, which means for places like Bangladesh, which get a lot of flooding, 1/3 more rice for those people because this rice has been engineered to hold its breath underwater for 2 weeks. And that means enormous gains there. Salt tolerance should come along increasingly because there is salt infusion from rising sea levels. And astonishingly, kind of a technical thing, but it's amazing, corn and sugar cane are of the very efficient plant form known as C4. It's a way they handle photosynthesis and their metabolism. And wheat and rice are much less efficient because they're C3. It is a profoundly deep biological thing to convert from C3 to C4, but that is now in process with rice a woman named Jane Langsdale, working out of London and out of the Rice Institute in the Philippines, is going to give a talk in San Francisco that I set up about how that's moving along. They can be made, things can be made more fertilizer efficient, or even they can improve the soil instead of taking away from it. You would like more carbon fixation. There's some tricks to do that, to get the carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil where it stays. You can make it so it's completely attuned to the climate and soil situation. And in the tropics, where instead of great big monocrops, often there's a lot of polyculture with trees and crops and animals and so on, you can attune it to that. Change of subject. Example. And this is in a way left over from the de-extinction session this morning. I mentioned that 1/4 of all the trees in the eastern deciduous forest here were American chestnuts. They got big, as you can see, and they got very, very productive. American chestnuts, in terms of, this was a real keystone species. This was a species that every single year drops down vast quantities of these beautiful sweet nuts, unlike oaks, which make acorns when they feel like it, and they're bitter anyway. So the amount of nuts coming down not only fed the humans who were interested, and the pigs that used to be released into the forest, like in southern France, and became very, very tasty, but of course no end of all of the other animals. And what it'll take to get them back, these things are advancing themselves. That's interesting. You can see the range. Here's Connecticut. Used to be totally through this area. It's referred to as the perfect tree. Everybody loved it for its lumber, for everything about it. And that's actually a very good book. And more than she knew at the time, Susan Frankel, the rebirth is underway because it needs to be reborn. The death was beginning of the century. A fungus came from Asia, maybe with some of the Chinese chestnuts that were brought over, and this blight killed billions of trees. It was just an ongoing crisis in the whole eastern forest from Mississippi to here. And they tried to head it off by cutting down vast quantities of trees. Nothing could head it off, and the fungus is still out there. So the tree is effectively extinct. There's a few around. There's a few stumps. You'll see the suckers come up and try to start a tree. The fungus finds them and kills them. So the trees are gone. But the rebirth got set in motion. This is Bill Powell, who along with Charles Maynard did the work to make this happen. He's at an event that Ryan and I organized called TEDx De-Extinction at National Geographic headquarters. And what Bill has done, and this is one of his slides, he was asked by members of the American Chestnut Foundation, the New York chapter, to see if there was a genetic shortcut, because what the foundation had been doing was trying to backcross Chinese chestnuts, which are relatively resistant to the fungus, with American chestnuts. And they went through 4 generations. It took 30 years. And F4, the 4th generation, was not bad, but it wasn't really an American chestnut. It was 1/16 Chinese, and it wasn't perfect yet. So they said, is there a way to go directly at this with genetic engineering? And Bill Powell and Maynard did. And they came up with a fungus-resistant gene from wheat that reduces the oxalate, which is what makes the canker, which is what kills the tree. And that was a pretty slick thing to do. They moved it into the tree. And what it does is it doesn't try to kill the fungus. It just makes it unharmful. And so there won't be any evolutionary selection against it. The saprophyte now is what it is. We'll be doing just fine. And one shouldn't worry about this too much, since this same enzyme is active in many other plants. This is one of the tests of where they inoculated these young plants, a Chinese chestnut, an American chestnut, and these new engineered chestnuts to see how they responded to the fungus. And as you can see, the engineered ones are doing fine, and even the Chinese chestnut is suffering. So this is one of those great successes, and it's the kind of the applause slide. Oh my God, it really works. The way that, sorry, this is a little dicey.
Everyone has trouble with this.
Everyone has trouble. And then we get to see how, thrown we are by that. Oh my God, my slide's wrong. This is one of Bill Powell's slides, basically showing that, as you can see, Darling 4 and then Darling 311. With Biotech, you're always trying to improve yet a bit further, and you can because you're there working at the genetic level. And indeed, the Darling 311 is more resistant than the Chinese chestnut to the fungus. They are now in the process of working through the 3 government, because it's a GMO. Why is it a GMO? It's a GMO because it's food. It's the only reason it's a GMO. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to go to all this trouble with the government. So it'll take 5 years or more. The government kind of likes it, but they've got to prove that no bad thing will happen any more than any other GMO. And but it's interesting because the government is used to dealing with private companies. Well, this is all, no private companies involved. It's just, university and nonprofits. They're used to dealing with patents. No patents involved. All this stuff is transparent. And the one thing they worry about is, what happens if this stuff gets released to the wild? And, oh my God, the gene flow will happen out there, and these things will infect other plants. The whole point is released to the wild. And then some people say, well, what if it behaves like an invasive species? Actually, that's the idea. We want to get 1/4 of the trees in the forest here to be American chestnuts again. And over a century, we probably will. So the interesting item in terms of GMOs is that partly because the American Chestnut Foundation has a following that has developed for 30 years. They have a great magazine and so on. People that can write senators and the rest of it. They've done Kickstarter campaigns. Stop that. And even though the various anti-GMO groups are well aware of the American chestnut, so far they haven't raised a fuss. That would be the ideal pattern moving forward. I'll give one other glimpse of the future, which is this is in a catalog which describes itself as carrying nothing but open pollinated, pure natural GMOs. As you can see, purist breeders of vegetables have a high old time making very, very weird plants. And that's one of the things that people do. They do it with dogs, they do it with vegetables, they do it with flowers. And you can well imagine that as this technology moves out of the garages where it is now and into the garden shed where it will arrive very shortly, that those kind of plants will get even stranger with GMO capabilities, and that's the future. Corey.
And how many of you would support and wish GMO progress to continue and to remain a prominent part of the food you eat? So that is the first question. We will ask it again at the end of the session. So who would actively support a very strong, a prominent presence of GMO in the food supply and continuing progress in research labs around the world? So click yes if you do, no if you don't. I don't think we have an abstain function on this, right? 1 is yes, 2 is no. 3 is undecided. Yes, that's right, the great political poll question. We're after you undecided, folks.
Now, whatever you do, don't push the send button because it blows up the house.
And they give you how long to actually vote? How long?
I think it was 9 seconds.
10 seconds, okay. Is your golden opportunity passed? Are we going to see the results? Don't they get flashed? They're working on the tabulators are tabulating busily behind the glass screen.
Aha, we actually got something. But
so,
that's the most general purpose questionnaire I think I've ever seen. And you will be punished if you get the wrong answer.
we need a recount. You're much too close, or actually they've been unable to tally those votes. So could you please revote quickly? Yes to 1, this question. Would you actively support research on GMOs in laboratories around the world and the consequential prominent role in the U.S. and worldwide food supply? 1, yes. 2, no. 3, undecided. Oh, you know, you can commandeer one from down here. I'm sure that there are many empty seats. Someone would just love for you to vote. Or you could influence someone else's vote. You could skew the entire thing with that one clicker. Okay.
Yes, no, don't know.
So we will see how we, you know, I'll be very surprised. Perhaps 2 is going to rise to 60% by the end of the session. But
It all depends on what you say now.
yeah, right, it's up to me. We're the Oxford Debating Union here. So I wanted to put into context some of what Stewart said in his fine presentation, which is, first of all, the chestnut example. I applaud that. And it's very cannily, cleverly, in fact, manipulatively chosen as an example. Because it is something that environmentalists have been avidly, if not desperately, behind for years. 15 years ago, I wrote a piece about the American Chestnut
Really?
Foundation in the Atlantic Monthly, as it was then called, where I'm still an editor. I'm so glad you showed Susan Frankel's book because she's a friend.
Uh-huh.
She then wrote Plastics, a
Good
Toxic Love Story, which is a very interesting book about the history of plastics. But her book is still available, the Chestnut book. But it's a very cleverly chosen example because it is something that's neutral. Everyone who grew up in the Northeast especially, or the South, wants to see the American chestnut restored. It has been this enormous puzzle. And you know, there were these Chinese genes that were being introduced that were themselves controversial. But the idea of being able to precisely engineer a gene and have it flourish where even the fastest crossbreeding was failing is a rather dramatic example of the progress that can be made with genetic engineering. Also, Stewart gives in his book a really good context of the different environmentalists because he comes from the environmental world and Friends of the Earth, and these are people you knew very well. It was a rather shocking rift when people were expelled for their beliefs, and it took on the aspect of a religious war. And what I've now done numerous panels on GMOs, and what I generally come in thinking is people have a conviction that is held with a religious fervor when they enter the discussion on GMOs. I have resigned myself long ago to not changing many people's minds don't confuse me with the facts. That's often the case with GMOs, but it's also one of the most interesting cases now before us. Stewart made the casual, but I think telling and significant comparison with the anti-vaccine mode, because it's something that's counterintuitive, and it's something that you don't think that all of your other convictions would lead you to support. So if you believe in organic food, in the simplest methods possible to raise your food, in using the fewest pesticides or herbicides, and we're now going down the slippery slope,
Right.
using the fewest number of inputs, as they're called in the farming world, in your farms, in disturbing the soil as little as possible. Presumably, you would also be against this kind of scientific meddling and meddling with evolution, which was already in the 70s when you're quoting fascinating letters. I think there's a letter from 1977 in which
Paul Ehrlich,
Paul Ehrlich wrote, you know, Paul Ehrlich, who's a god of the environmentalist movement, wrote, and some of what he said in 1977, as Stewart says, still applies. Homo sapiens has been meddling with evolution in many ways, and for a long time. We started in a big way when we domesticated plants and animals. And then I'll skip a lot. There's evidence that bacterial species have been swapping DNA among themselves for a very long time, and perhaps even exchanging with higher organisms. And so he said, in my view, the brightest promise of recombinant DNA is as a general research tool for molecular geneticists. So, already he was supporting it. But we would think that it would lead us to the idea that we would be against GMOs, and in fact, GMO helps in every one of those instances. And I do think, for context, and I'd like you to then chime in and lay out, and we'll have plenty of time for audience participation. When people object to GMOs, often they are objecting to an entire system around the use of GMOs that raises red flags and objections in a way that is pretty entirely separate from GMOs themselves. Some of those contexts are, we were talking about pesticides and herbicides. The amount of toxins that applying lots of herbicide and pesticides cause in runoff and water runoff, and the affecting the water supply. That happens in large-scale industrial farming. It in many cases happens more with non-GMO crops. It's not universal, there's no absolute rule, but in many cases GMOs help reduce that. There's also the idea that using glyphosate-resistant, which is to say Roundup-ready crops, will encourage the growth of so-called superweeds, although what it really is resistant weeds, because superweeds generally refers to transgenic genes that have jumped into weeds and make them yet more resistant. What most people use superweeds rather loosely to refer to is weeds that have developed resistance to glyphosate. And so that is to say Roundup doesn't, it's kryptonite. Roundup won't work. Strong bullets bounce off its chest. So the idea that crops will evolve resistance, that's what happens in nature. They become resistant. And what happens is, and it happens on a large scale, farmers have to return to dicamba and other much more toxic herbicides and pesticides once this resistance is formed. So that's a great rule against glyphosate. But in the meantime, there's been an enormous amount of inputs that have been reduced, across every place that has used these around the world. So it's the idea of too many inputs being used. Another one is patents. Patents on plants, patents on genes. That's something that we're not actually talking about today, and another reason that Stewart's selection of the chestnut example was particularly sly, because that was an open source patent. So you really are setting everyone up. You're leading us down the primrose, the non-GMO, or the GMO primrose path.
It's a primrose path that actually has primroses.
That has primroses that are still non-resistant. By giving us an example of something that was open source and anyone can use, was never patented, and was encouraged to research. But what many people are objecting to when they use the word GMO, when they think about GMOs, is Monsanto, which is a stand-in for many, many other companies, it's not just Monsanto, that are patenting genes, that are in fact funding and taking over a lot of formerly academic research that was the province of land-grant universities. So those are other auxiliary issues that are live issues. They're important. They're not settled at all. But people are using GMO as a proxy to talk about them instead of just looking at GMOs and thinking about GMOs. And another, and perhaps the largest one, is monoculture. So the idea that large industries, once they get hold of one of these expensive GMO seeds, they're just going to carpet the landscape with those. And monoculture in any kind of agricultural system is harmful. It's not the best way of stewarding land. It's just not the best way of using land. Now we're getting into, okay, so now we're getting into...
area we might disagree. That's good.
All right, so let's get into an area of disagreement. And we'll have Stewart's defend monoculture. But most people think that monoculture is a stand-in for the demise of the family farm. Although, as Stewart points out in his book, the family farm has become a much larger consolidated farm because most families encourage their children to go to college and get off the farm. And so this creates a great vacuum of young farmers, which organizations in our area of the world, have any of you heard of Greenhorns? Have any of you heard of the Carrot Project? These are organizations right in this Foodshed. I hope you all love the term Foodshed, which is to say about 100 miles radius from around
Foodshed.
Kent, Connecticut, of food that is farmed and produced here. So right in our Foodshed, there are these organizations that are trying to encourage young farmers to come back to the land, to be able to have access to affordable rentals of land. And I think that there are probably numerous people in this room who have done their personal bit to encourage farming on their own land, to bring back agricultural use to land that has been out of production. So that's all terrific, but it's not going to solve a lot of problems that Stewart might wish to discuss. So do you wish to defend monoculture?
Well,
The
mainly,
evil of the age, I might
let me
add.
say something about small and large, because the main event is the developing world and how agriculture works, especially in the tropics, which is quite different than agriculture here in the temperate zone. They have different crops, and they grow all year long. And the pests never hibernate. They just keep coming, ditto with the weeds. The uptake of GMO crops in the world outside of the U.S. has been almost entirely by smallholders, yeomen, small farmers. And they need every advantage they can because it's relentless. And what it means is you can send kids to school instead of having them out there endlessly weeding, endlessly dealing with the pests, the birds that come and eat all the sorghum and the rest of it.
And one of the great unknown facts, or you probably all know this fact, that the school schedule of this part of the world, as opposed to Atlanta, where I'm now living part-time, where they began August 1st, it's entirely scheduled around the agricultural harvest cycle and when the children would be needed on the farm.
Yep.
And with the harvest, but please go on.
So in the developing world, they're still needed on the farm unless they can do very efficient, often monocrop. I mean, even in your garden, you don't usually plant your corn hither and yon. There's a stand where the corn is, and you defend that against the raccoons. This is just that writ large. Generally, one of the things that makes agriculture efficient and therefore makes it more intense and frees up more land to be wild is monoculture, intelligent, getting water to the plants with drip irrigation and things like that, is the intelligent use of fertilizer, or even doctoring the plants so that they, in a sense, create their own fertilizer. All of this makes smaller stands. And the same thing, by the way, goes on in the timber industry. The reason we're now beyond peak timber, according to Jesse Ossibel, is because we've done more and more tree plantations, which are way more efficient than cutting wild trees. The same thing goes in the oceans. The largest area of environmental damage right now is in the oceans because we're hunting wild predators. It's like we're hunting wolves and eating them when we go after tuna and cod and swordfish and so on. When those are grown in mariculture and aquaculture and close, efficient, well-managed, keep the bad things from happening in terms of illness and so on, which you can do, then that frees up the wild fish to stay wild. So generally, Norman Borlaug's green revolution is moving into a second generation referred to as the doubly green revolution, which is it's not only more efficient and works better for farmers everywhere, but it's better for the environment. And
Much better, because the original green revolution is now almost entirely discredited among environmentalists.
And it's weird.
Because of the nitrogen application it required.
And that's one byproduct. Look, a number of things happened in the environmental movement in the 70s that I was part of the creating of, I guess. It came partly out of the New Left, so it was anti-corporate, so Monsanto was an automatic villain. I think that conservationists should be pretty agnostic about where the good comes from. If it comes from a corporation, fine. Nature Conservancy, for example.
But that's been heresy for a long time. If it comes from a corporation, fine.
But it shouldn't be. It's not an environmental issue. It's a political, economic issue. Okay. It was romantic. It was the hippies that I was part of, and so there was a kind of an anti-technology bias built in there, and do-it-yourself, and do communes, all of which failed. And we all learned our lesson, but other people believe that that's the back to the land. And what they didn't know is how boring it is out there. They didn't know how insanely hard any level of farming is. And it's mostly in the developing world done by women who would rather be in town, having more fun, getting rid of the jerk they're married to, and raising their kids in the way they can get an education. So this is part of the massive movement around the world away from the poverty trap of subsistence farming into the opportunity of being in cities, hence nuclear to give the electricity and so on. And it was a movement that became a movement with a kind of a whole ideological, spiritual frame to it. I was just hearing the other day about Dave Brower referring to a number of books that were being reviewed in Not Man Apart, his early publication. And one of them was good and the other three were bad. And the reviewer wanted to say this one's good and these others aren't. And Dave wouldn't let her do that because we're saving the world. We got to promote everything. And that non-discrimination became, unfortunately, one of the things that you do this ideological framing of everything, and you know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and life is simple, but you know, any biologist knows life is not simple.
May I interrupt you there? That's
Yes,
beautifully put and a perfect segue to let me recommend 2 articles for you all to bookmark and look at that have been very influential to me in my thinking. One is by William Salatan, spelled S-A-L-E-T-A-N, in Slate. It ran about 2 weeks ago. It ran in, or maybe 3. It ran in July, and it was the result of a year's worth of looking into the history of opposition to GMOs, especially among the media, especially among lawsuits, and it is beautifully thorough. And he is somebody who writes for a very liberal audience. He himself is very liberal, and he's blistering in many contexts in his past work. I'm a great admirer of his work. Salatan, S-A-L-E-T-A-N, Slate, in July. And he documents one by one the cases that have been made against GMO by various activists. And the amount of evidence they selectively shut out of GMO safety of crops. And in every case, he points out what it would have been like if another case had been being made for something that we all hate, and the kind of evidence that was suppressed. And he also makes the anti-vaccine comparison. But for example, are you all familiar with almost every papaya that we eat now is genetically engineered because papayas were at risk of extinction in Hawaii? And there was long time genetic engineering. It was never patented. It was made available to all Hawaiian farmers for free so that they could save their crops. You know, it was there for the taking. It was helping revive a native indigenous agriculture. It wasn't patented. For years, there were hundreds of thousands of people, if not hundreds of millions, who've eaten GE corn that are safe and unharmed. Something for you all to remember when you look at Chipotle and the various companies that are now really surprisingly recently announcing we're going non-GMO. They, like all large corporations, are following the market. If the market is there and says, we're afraid of GMOs, we're worried about the technology, we don't quite know about it, they'll say, let us remove your concerns. And you know, they say that while they're frantically looking for substitutes for things like cornstarch that are almost impossible to find non-GMO. Everyone gleefully seized on Chipotle for continuing to offer sodas with corn syrup. Every single soda that is sweetened has genetically modified organisms. Europe, which banned GMO 10 or by now 15 years ago, no, because it was 10 years at the time of your writing this book. One of the largest population studies. There are no health indicators that are different that might be affected by GMO consumption in Europe and the United States. And also, all of the meat that came in to the European Union had feed, and a lot of the feed that Europeans buy for their own animals is genetically engineered. It's very hard to police these boundaries, which is something that people who are against GMOs are rightly worried about. the boundaries have been pierced long ago.
Right.
It's almost impossible. So these are things to bear in mind. But I was going to put a provocative question to you, not that you've ever
No,
had one
really.
in your life, and we're about to open to questions, which is, say that GMO was just a concern in the United States. Do you think that there are enough non-technically GMO, and it's such a tough distinction to make, plants available to U.S. growers that agriculture could continue? Whereas I think that many of us would agree that in Africa and the developing world, drought-resistant plants are essential to the future. Vitamin-enhanced golden rice with vitamin A, another example of a plant that's open source and not patented, can be essential. You showed the Canberra destruction. But do you suppose that for the rich few who can afford to worry about this, say, are there enough non-GMO seeds available in the U.S. food supply to continue not using them if everyone went the way of Chipotle?
Well, Europe is the still strange example. They are, trying to keep out GMO crops, and except for the workarounds that you talk about.
Also, all pet food.
And
all pet food that goes into Europe, GMO.
Many cheeses, lots of beers, most of the medicines, pet food. It's leaky out there. That's what the GMO folks are looking for now is not so much the banning in the U.S. as the labeling in the U.S. And the labeling issue seems perfectly innocuous. You want to know, is it GMO or not? And it's
in fact, the campaign is called Just Label It.
And there would be, I think, a good reason for it if there was any health effects, if there was any environmental effects. There's not. So it's very close to the organic labeling, which is got a lot of fiction in it. And in fact, Nina Fedorov refers to organic as the biggest marketing hoax in history. There's something to that. All you got to do is call something organic, and now it turns out if you can call it non-GMO, you can charge twice or three times as much for it, even though it's the same, or effectively the same. So we have the luxury in the developing world, in the developed world, in North America and in Europe, to screw around with this. But to take our food fads and enforce them on the rest of the world where things are pretty desperate. And so, another one of the non-patented things is the flood-free rice that's going into Bangladesh and is released, is working, and there's fabulous stories coming out of there. Anti-GMO folks want that not to happen. In India, Vandana Shiva goes around telling lies hither and yon. She says, there's this thing called the Terminator gene, and it's going to kill all life if it gets out. And it's lies top to bottom. The gene she's referring to should be called the maiden ant gene, because it was just an attempt to make corn with that particular gene in it basically sterile. Which, by the way, all hybrid corn is basically sterile as far as the farmer is concerned, because hybrid corn doesn't breed true. And if you try to keep your hybrid corn seeds and make the next generation of corn out of it, you get garbage. So farmers have been buying seeds every year from the seed suppliers for many, many decades. And hybrid corn especially was one of the great increasers of agricultural efficiency, drastically. And we wouldn't, it would be like saying, oh, hybrid corn, wait, that's kind of weird, that's kind of against nature. We're playing God there. The hubris is out of hand with this hybrid stuff. Let's drop all hybrid corn. That would start to starve America.
Thank you. We have to open it to questions. I will ask them to be short questions, and I feel I must stipulate, although you all know this, that I don't mean to gloss over examples of corporate malfeasance. There's plenty of corporate malfeasance. So let me just stipulate that in case any of you are going to tell stories about it. So the first hand that went up is the gentleman with the sweater in the middle, blue. And why don't you start while a mic comes right to you?
You want them to stand and sing out their name and stuff?
Sing out your name and make a quick question, please.
Why is there no benefit? Why should not
GMO foods be labeled? Since a good some portion of regulatory or other regimes in Europe and elsewhere, whether you agree with it or not, feel they should be so people can decide whether they want them. Why do you think that's so beyond the pale?
Yeah, what's your problem?
Makes no sense.
Well, if I were a Republican, I would say that's another layer of regulation that we don't need. No, actually, I'm a Democrat. Because the Republicans went crazy in 1994, and they're going to stay crazy for a while. But I'd rather be a conservative if I could, but it's not possible in this country. That's another topic. The labeling, actually the hybrid, should all the hybrid crops be labeled as hybrid crops? You think they should?
Yes.
Okay, that will increase the price at the market for the people who are having to go through all of that process. And it'll be different in different states, which is, by the way, the current situation of, 4 states or sort of thing, they've got to label the GMOs.
I have much to say about this.
Yeah.
I just have a little to say because we want to get to more questions. Which is, I myself am agnostic. I don't know. I haven't fully evolved, but it's a question of whether putting GMO on a label implies more toxicity than anything else. I myself wouldn't mind seeing it. But as the Salatin and other articles point out, if you really want to know about toxicity, there's lots of things in organic food that could be called toxic. If in fact you're an extremely informed consumer and you feel you simply want to know whether they're genetically modified organisms, I can't say I disagree with that. I do say I would wish to see one federal standard rather than a state-by-state solution, and I would wish to see it evolved in a very sensible way without complete collusion with corporations, which is what most people fear would happen if there were a federal rule. But as it took 20 years for there to be organic standards, and they're very controversial, as Stewart points out, to this day, they evolved. It became one federal standard, and I would wish to see a similar progress with a GMO label if it came to be. We had other hands up, the gentleman and in the purple, and then we'll try to get to you.
I guess over the past 10, 15 years traveling in Europe, I've been struck by the religious mania associated with the anti-GMO crowd, from labeling to press reports to agricultural policy. And it seems much more strident there than in the US. What's behind that? Because I've always wondered, is it actually a form of agricultural protection associated with the existing European agricultural system, or was it in fact a consumer-led rebellion? So I just would love to hear your thoughts on what's behind that religious mania, because it's so prevalent in Europe.
There's a gentleman here who wrote a book about eugenics a few years ago, and I asked him on the bus last night, is eugenics in one of the many shadows left behind the Nazi regime in Europe? And he said in Germany it is the case that master race and eugenics and all this crap left a very suspicious feeling about messing around with genetics, that you're somehow that's going deep. In places like France, it's more apparently what you suggest. It's a protectionist they're very protective of the farmers there, and exactly the way they are, and they'll subsidize that at great expense in order to keep the whole farming regime in France the way it's been for quite a while. Do not mess with it. Also, they don't especially want competition from African crops, which Africans need to sell cash crops to Europe to get the hell out of poverty. As it is now, they're selling it to China, and China doesn't care about biotech being an issue. So that, Europe, in a way, cut itself out of helping Africa in that respect.
Let me make a point that when I was researching my book on slow food, a movement whose ideals I still believe in and espouse,
Me too.
I discovered that there is, you cross a line you don't mean to cross, and you just have to be careful not to cross it, when you're defending a country's regional food traditions and wish that country and that area to understand, celebrate, and continue its food traditions in an economically viable way, as I do. And then you carry that over into a kind of protectionism and xenophobia that can be quite unsavory and leads right into the the origins of ethnography in Germany, which was twisted into National Socialism, from the 1880s to the 1920s, is a very unfortunate progress. So we run that risk when we're celebrating local native traditions, which I most certainly do. Another question, because we have to run another vote soon.
Tina Freeman, I wanted to ask about the connection between BT corn and monarch butterflies.
Between BT corn and...
BT corn and monarch butterflies, which if you
that's a good
buy
one.
this book, you will actually see a chapter on.
Yeah, monarch butterflies are wonderful. I studied them as an ecologist because they're one of the first examples of coevolution. Monarchs, basically in the north, not in Mexico, in the north, feed on milkweed. Milkweed has a cardiac glycoside in it, a poison, which these bright colored or slow flying orange butterflies advertise to the birds, I am full of cardiac glycoside, you really don't want to eat me. And they are indeed poisonous. And then the viceroy pretends to be a monarch butterfly without actually having the poison in it, and. So milkweed is essential to monarch butterfly. When this stuff first came along, some of the environmentalists said, well, these things really don't work against weeds, and therefore they shouldn't happen. Well, it turns out they work great against weeds. And unfortunately, one of the most susceptible weeds to glyphosate is milkweed. But it really is a weed. So the farmer's happy, but the monarch butterflies and us monarch lovers are less happy. A very good crop now to raise in the Midwest is milkweed. It's not good for us. Cardiac glycoside isn't comfortable in our system either, but the butterflies will make up for it. They will come in profusion and make your yard fantastic. And this is indeed going on. You got to get the right kind of native milkweed. There's some decorative garden milkweeds that the butterflies don't like as much. But the workaround there is to basically make sure that there's plenty of milkweed there. The main place that the butterflies are in trouble now, and they're not going extinct or anything, but their population is down, is at the Mexico end of their enormous migration, where there's been deforestation that also is gradually being headed off. So the monarch butterflies, I think, are, besides an absolutely loved insect, and there's not many of those,
And besides
and they're an indicator of the system working well, which you're right.
Besides this book, which I encourage you to buy, Sue Halpern, who happens to be married to Bill McKibben, wrote a wonderful monograph on the monarch butterfly and the troubles in Mexico, which I heartily encourage you to read. Halpern, Susan Halpern. It is time for us to run another vote. I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions because we've gone into our run over. And that is vote yes, which is number 1. If you encourage the active support of academic research.
Wait a minute, look what just happened. The new question is, should GMOs be regulated?
That's not the question. So that's not the question we started with. So I will again repeat the question. Do you encourage the active, unfettered, which would be unregulated, research into GMOs in the laboratories of private and public research institutions, and the consequent robust presence in the U.S. food supply and the world food supply? 1 if yes, 2 if no, 3 if undecided. I'm just hearing the Jeopardy theme music.
This may go the other way. When anybody talks this long about something, there must be something wrong with it.
Do we have a vote? Gentleman in the back?
Oh, isn't that sweet?
Okay. Well, our work is done.
All
and
right,
we thank
fist
you very
bump.
much for coming.